You know, every nation kind of runs on a set of promises. There's the promise the government makes to its people, and then there's the promise the people make back to their nation. In this explainer, we're going to break down that exact relationship, the state's huge to-do list and the citizen's personal pledge. Have you ever really thought about that? I mean, if a country was a business, what would its mission statement be? What are the big, lofty goals it's trying to achieve? Well, that's not just some philosophical question. It's actually written down, and it acts like a North Star for the entire government. All right, so let's start with that national to-do list. In constitutional terms, we call these goals the directive principles of state policy. Just think of them as the ambitious, long-term goals a country sets for itself, the big picture stuff. Okay, so what does that really mean? Well, a good way to think about the directive principles is like they're the Constitution's conscience. They're basically there to push the government toward creating what's called a welfare state, a society that's all about social justice and economic well-being for everybody, not just a handful of people at the top. And hey, these aren't just some vague ideas floating around. They're actually spelled out in Articles 36 to 51 of the Constitution. And fun fact, they were inspired by the Constitution of Ireland. They're even officially described as being fundamental in the governance of the country. Now, that sounds super important, right? But here's where it gets really interesting. And this is the big twist. Even though they're called fundamental, you can't actually sue the government for not following one. They're non-justiciable. So that brings up a huge question, right? If you can't enforce them in a court of law, what's the point of even having them?
Well, their power isn't legal, it's moral. They act as a compass to guide the laws that get made. And they generally follow three different philosophical paths, all heading toward the same destination, national progress. Let's break down what those paths are.
First up, we have the socialistic principles. These are all about creating social and economic equality. We're talking about things like making sure there's equal pay for equal work, preventing all the wealth from ending up in just a few people's hands, and of course, protecting the rights and health of workers. This is basically the blueprint for that welfare state we mentioned. Second, you've got the Gandhian principles. As you can probably guess, these are based on the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi. The focus here is on building democracy from the ground up, so through things like village councils or Panchayati Raj. They also promote local, self-sufficient economies through things like cottage industries. And the third path is the liberal intellectual principles. This bucket is full of ideas you'd find in a modern liberal democracy. We're talking about really ambitious goals here, like creating a single uniform civil code for all citizens, making sure the court system stays totally independent from government pressure, and promoting peace and harmony on the world stage. Okay, so we've got these huge society-wide goals, but this leads to a really important question. What happens when the government's work toward one of these big goals seems to step on the toes of an individual's personal freedoms? You know, their legally protected fundamental rights. And this is really where the rubber meets the road. On one hand, you've got your fundamental rights. These are all about protecting you, the individual. You can literally walk into a court and demand they be protected. But on the other hand, you have these directive principles, which are all about the good of the entire society. So you see the big difference? One is like a legal hammer you can actually use, and the other is more of a moral compass for the nation as a whole. So which one wins in a head-to-head fight? Well, generally speaking, your fundamental rights do have the upper hand in a direct conflict. But the courts really try to avoid a big showdown. The true goal is to find harmony, to read the laws in a way that creates a balance between what an individual needs and what the country is trying to achieve in the long run. So we've talked a lot about the government's to-do list. But this whole constitutional agreement, it's not a one-way street. There's another side to this coin, and it's a set of duties laid out for every single citizen. This is where you come in. These are called the fundamental duties. Just think of them as the moral obligations we all have. If your rights are what the country promises you, then your duties are what you promise your country in return. It's a pledge to be an active part of upholding the nation's unity and spirit. Now, these duties weren't actually in the original Constitution. They were added back in 1976 under Article 51A. And get this, just like the directive principles, they are also non-justiciable. So you can't be hauled into court just for not doing one, but they're still considered a really critical piece of the whole constitutional puzzle. And this right here is a perfect example of how a constitution isn't just some old dusty document. It evolves.
The list started out with 10 duties, but years later, an 11th duty was added, which makes it a responsibility for parents to give their kids educational opportunities.
So what's actually in this pledge? Well, it covers the stuff you might expect, like respecting national symbols, taking care of the environment. But it also includes some really interesting things, like actively promoting harmony between different groups of people, and even a duty to develop a scientific temper. That basically means a commitment to thinking rationally and relying on evidence. These are all seen as the building blocks for a really responsible and engaged society.
So let's put it all together. What you've really got is this incredible balancing act. You have the government's guiding principles, its big aspirational goals. You have the citizens' moral pledge, their duties to the nation. And right there in the middle, you have your individual fundamental rights, with the courts constantly trying to find that perfect harmony between the needs of society and the freedom of each person.
And all of that leaves us with one really important question to think about. When you look at this constant push and pull between the goals of the state, your rights as an individual, and your duties as a citizen, do you think the balance is right? That's a question that every single